before we get into that, I want to develop a counter-argument, one which doesn't originate with me, but with some of those who've reviewed your book, and all the reviews I've seen have been extremely favorable, but some of the best reviewers, among them Andrew Hacker, who did the review in the New York Review of Books.
Yes.
He makes this point quite clearly, and some others have as well. Now, this takes a little bit of developing, but I'm going to launch into it right now. You might have recapitulated at this point that it would also serve their purposes wonderfully well, that tripartite conspiracy, if, having assassinated the president, they can set things up so that it can all be blamed, not upon themselves, but rather can be blamed upon an agent of, or at least an enthusiast for Castro. And Oswald had, as you see it, developed that false identity in the earlier months. The crucial argument raised by Hacker and others is this. They say, Summers' argument falls on Oswald and his location in Dallas and working in the school book depository. The plan to go to Dallas had not been formulated finally till just a few days before, in fact, the visit took place, and the route of the motorcade was not finally set at all. You could not have planted Oswald as a patsy agent in that building months before in any expectation that it would have provided the opportunity to shoot from a window and assassinate a president. Therefore, though Summers, says Hacker, does raise very useful questions about Oswald and does persuade me, he says, that Oswald was not merely what we have so long taken him to be, the conspiracy doesn't make any sense at that final moment, because it was almost an accident of last-minute planning that the president was passing through Dealey Plaza in that open limousine and that Lee Harvey Oswald was working in a building on that route.
I agree that there's a problem, but it's not a problem quite of the nature that Mr. Hacker has pointed up. He gets his facts slightly wrong. The fact is that the visit of the president to Dallas had been known for many weeks, months. The precise route of the motorcade had been known for much longer than Mr. Hacker has suggested. I'd have to go back to sources, indeed to my own book, to remember exactly when, but it wasn't just a few days before. They did know which way the schedule was going to go, which way the motorcade was going to go, although there were minor changes in that route. Now, what is more interesting is Oswald's presence specifically in the warehouse overlooking the motorcade route. It is a fact that I think unquestionably so that Oswald got that job because a totally harmless neighbor of the family where his wife was staying suggested that there might be some work going at the Texas School Book Depository.
Well, that doesn't sound like plot, does it?
No. I have problems with that. I don't know how it fits in. Look, what I've done with this whole story is to try to sweep away a lot of the underbrush, the rumors and the counter-rumors that have grown up around this thing, to try to put the jigsaw together. Where the bits are obviously nothing to do with the jigsaw we're trying to put together, I put them in another box and got rid of them, put them out of the way, and it was high time somebody did that. Where they don't fit, I haven't tried to squeeze them into place. I've simply put them on one side and left them there as question marks. The fact is that we now have a great deal more of the jigsaw than we did before, and the fact that one has a problem with that piece of the evidence, which indeed I entirely accept and would love to have worked out, does not, of course, negate the mass of other evidence that indicates heavy links with organized crime, heavy links with, well, certainly the great possibility of Oswald links with U.S. intelligence and the possibility that U.S. intelligence was involved with the mafia and the anti-Castro people in the assassination. I think in the end, some jurist once said that you look at a case and in the end you have to put it to the jury, and you're the judge trying to advise the jury on what to do and how to look at the evidence. And you have to ask yourselves, which pile of evidence is the greater? Which one weighs heavier in the scales? And the evidence for conspiracy and involvement with the forces we've been talking about is far heavier and greater than these individual problems which, as a mere reporter, I have failed so far to work out.
A moment to say that this is WGN, Clear Channel Radio from Chicago. We're racking up the phone calls now. Some lines are still open if you want to get in on the conversation and put a question directly to Anthony Summers. The number 591-7200. 591-7200. A last query before we pause for some commercials and then on to the telephones. We've had a number of investigations, starting with the Warren Commission. We've had lots of private investigators. Many have suspected conspiracy and have picked up some strands of the story that you've now far more fully elicited and woven together. But, on the other hand, the official doctrine, the received doctrine, on the part of those supposedly competent to judge the evidence, has, till the present moment, been single crazed assassin, and that's what accounts for it. Did some people, as far back as the membership of the Warren Commission, know more than they acknowledged? Was there not only a conspiracy to kill the president, but then a conspiracy to hush up the assassination, to cover it up?
I think you have to be very careful with this, and I'm afraid I'm not going to give you a very short answer. How long do we have to go?
Don't worry about time.
The reason I have to give you a long answer is this, and it helps me because I wanted to add a point at the end of this section of the program about the real international gravity, that the situation of international gravity that the assassination caused, which perhaps one gets away from when we're into these nitty-gritty little bits of evidence. Now, the fact is that after the assassination, a mass of disinformation about Oswald, black propaganda, came out of Mexico City, which Oswald had visited in the weeks before the assassination, and where a person calling himself Oswald, and I stress that, had visited communist embassies, Soviet and Cuban embassies, asking for visas to go to Cuba. Now, it is my impression that it was not the real Oswald who did this, and that episode was part of what you just described, an attempt to paint a trail of guilt towards Havana, towards the communists.
And towards an agent of the Castro government, or at least an enthusiast for that government.
Now, reports and heavy information along those lines poured across President Johnson's desk in the hours and days after the assassination. And indeed, he was to go to his death years later, believing, as he put it, that Castro had President Kennedy killed as a preemptive strike in view of the CIA plots against his own life. What we have not known until a week ago, when the chief counsel of the Assassinations Committee, Professor Blakey, mentioned it on a television program discussing my book, Conspiracy, is that the Russians went on a nuclear alert after the assassination, and it was defused when President Johnson hastily called in the Russian ambassador and said, look, yes, we are getting the reports that they knew about as well, indicating a link with the communist world, between Oswald and the communist world. We are aware of that, but there is not going to be rioting, anti-Soviet rioting in the streets. We are going to keep the lid on this area, and no, we are not going to do anything military against either the Soviet Union or against Cuba. And he defused that extremely dangerous situation. I think the implications are that if you go along with the assassination scenario that we've discussed this evening, that there was an attempt to do away with the president to achieve the ends we've discussed, and at the same time to cause a military lashback against Havana. Now, I think that the Warren Commission, which was made up of men on the whole, worthy public men, may well have been concerned as a result of that initial situation of international gravity to keep the communist steam in the kettle, and that the effect of keeping the communist steam in the kettle was to cover up steam of a completely different color.
Among the members of that Warren Commission were not only Chief Justice Warren and the future President of the United States, Gerald Ford, but of course Allen Dulles, who was then still the director of the CIA.
When I talked about worthy public men, I was intending to leave rather in brackets the role of Allen Dulles, because Allen Dulles is now known to have coached CIA officers on how to appear before the Commission, and also, of course, we now know that he knew about the attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, and he didn't tell his colleagues on the Warren Commission about it. I've also left out a factual anecdote. Chief Justice Warren was called in by LBJ and asked to start the Warren Commission And Warren said, well, I'd rather not do this, really. And LBJ told him, look, it's your patriotic duty to do this, because if the reports now gaining credence do gain public credence in this country, we may drift into a situation which could lead the country into a war costing 40 million lives. A nuclear war.
Fascinating. As every word you've said and every word you've written in Conspiracy is indeed fascinating. We're going to pause, take care of some overdue commercials, then right on to the telephones. If you don't get through at first, the best strategy is to call again as soon as we say goodnight to a previous caller. The number 591-7200, right back after this.
Again, here's Milt Rosenberg.
Thank you very much, George. My guest tonight, Anthony Summers, who is a native Englishman, sometimes resident in Ireland these days, has worked as an investigative reporter for the BBC, is the author of what I take to be the most interesting, the most authoritative volume on the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The name of that book, Conspiracy, it's just published by McGraw-Hill. Our phone number, 591-7200. 312 is the area code for long-distance calls. And here is a long-distance call. Where are you calling from, please?
Calling from Charleston, Illinois.
How far away is that?
Oh, gee, about 4 hours.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Yes, I'd like to know what, if you uncovered any information about Marina Oswald and what her role was, if any, and also what did you think about her book, where she was seemed very anxious to present the party line on the assassination?
Yes, I'm glad you asked about that, because we haven't talked about Marina Oswald in this program. Clearly she bears a lot of investigation. Marina Oswald, of course, was Soviet woman, and Oswald met her in the Soviet Union and brought her home, and they had 2 children, lived in the United States together before the assassination. Marina Oswald, well, she has told different stories to different commissions, different committees, many different testimonies, and quite often her testimony conflicts within a single testimony. The House Assassinations Committee flatly did not believe her on many areas and said very caustically in its final report that it seemed very odd indeed that she was unable to account for any of her husband's associations or associates in the summer of 1963. Frankly, she just isn't plausible. The interesting area about her, though, for me, is what exactly brought her into contact with Oswald in the first place in the Soviet Union. We haven't talked about the role of the KGB and the Soviets in this program, but they have claimed, that when Oswald, who had worked as a Marine on a U-2 spy base, and subsequently in a secure base in California and so on, with classified clearances, that when he arrived in the Soviet Union and defected, that they took no real interest in him, let him live there, but they didn't debrief him or interrogate him.
That was the testimony given by Yuri Nosenko, as I remember it.
That's right.
A KGB agent who defected, except that lots of people in the CIA were not convinced that he was a true defector, but thought he might be a double agent, and that almost broke the CIA apart, the struggle over whether to authenticate Nosenko.
Well, yes, indeed. That's a complex area, but he came and one of the things he said was, look, and he appeared to have been specifically sent to say this, look, we didn't have anything to do with Oswald, we weren't involved with Oswald, and ergo we are not involved in the assassination. The fact is that it's ridiculous in anybody's book who knows anything about intelligence to think that the Russians did not have a very heavy interest in Oswald. The fact is that in those days the Russians were interested in compromising mere tourists to the Soviet Union to try and get information from them. They were interested in the doorman at the embassy, the Marine Guards.
But Tony, now you're beginning to confuse me, because now it almost begins to sound as if you're suggesting, and I'm sure you don't contend this, that Oswald was under the control of the KGB rather than having been prepped and shaped
hold on.
by the American CIA.
No, hold on. I'd like to finish on Marina first. It is noteworthy that whilst I think we can accept that, of course, the Soviets did heavily interrogate and debrief this man who came to them with a Marine background, saying that he wanted to give them radar secrets. That's what he'd said at the U.S. Embassy when he defected. That they may have put Marina Oswald across his path. It's an age-old intelligence technique to use the woman in such a case. And it's interesting that when the CIA was digging into Marina's background, they found in her address books and personal papers and so on that she had lived for a period at an address in Leningrad, it said, at the U.S. Embassy when he defected, that they may have put Marina Oswald across his path. It's an age-old intelligence technique to use the woman in such a case. And it's interesting that when the CIA was digging into Marina's background, they found in her address books and personal papers and so on that she had lived for a period at an address in Leningrad, and this address was the address at which another American defector, also with a service background, had stayed shortly after he arrived in the Soviet Union. And of course, it was months later in Minsk that Marina turned up and supposedly met Oswald by chance at a dance. I would speculate with some enthusiasm on the evidence that Marina was simply placed across Oswald's trail as a way to find out, and this is what I think was important to the Soviets, to find out whether he was a genuine defector or not. And something that we haven't had time to talk enough about is the question of whether Oswald, when he went to the Soviet Union, although he was no James Bond, whether he was not a witting or an unwitting tool of U.S. intelligence, in that he was perhaps a false defector sent to gather low-level intelligence data, which is the grist of the mill of any intelligence network. What we do know now is that there was at the time a scheme supposedly run by naval intelligence, incidentally, which would be the logical background for Oswald since he was in the Marine Corps, to put supposedly disaffected, disenchanted young Americans into Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union as false defectors, where they would stay and then return, bringing with them low-level information of the sort that intelligence networks need. I think that's a real possibility in the case of Oswald. And incidentally, there had been very few, and literally one or two defectors from the United States and the Soviet Union between the end of the war and 1959, and then just at the moment that Oswald went over, a whole rash of other defectors went over. It's extremely suspect.
Sir, I thank you for a very valuable question.
Oh, yes. Could I also ask...
I fear not, because we've got so many people waiting. If you will allow me, I must get on to another caller. Thank you very much. 591-7200, and here is that next caller. Good evening. You're on the air. Hello? Hello, are you there? Apparently not, so we'll go on to yet another. Good evening. You're on the air.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
I would like to address Mr. Summers in this question.
Go ahead.
I, myself, have for years placed Nixon in this plot for the following reasons. He hated Kennedy. He had blind ambition. He would fall into the renegade CIA mentality. And later we see him pardoning Hoffa. Does this fit into the whole plan somewhere, or is that totally unreasonable?
I hope Mr. Nixon's lawyers were not listening to you, but I'm a reporter, as I've said probably tediously 2 or 3 times on this program, and I've tried to assemble the evidence. People have speculated along these sort of lines about all sorts of people, including Mr. Nixon before. There is no evidence for any such thing. There is, and I can only answer you that, except to tell you a funny story, which is that various public personalities, including then former Vice President Nixon, were asked after the assassination how they'd learned the news, where they had been at the time of the assassination. Well, what our friend Tricky Dicky said was, I learned the news of the assassination in a cab in New York City. And that was fine, and that was written down, and that was that. Except that then people came forward to say that former Vice President Nixon had been in Dallas, at the airport in Dallas, on the morning of the assassination. And
doing some work on a mission for Pepsi-Cola, as I remember it.
That's right. He was a consultant. I think he was a vice president, perhaps, at that time for Pepsi-Cola, which had just finished a convention in Dallas. And indeed, what he had left out of his original statement was the fact that he'd been in Dallas that morning. It may have been inadvertent, but it always makes me laugh, the notion that the man couldn't quite give a straight answer even to something that left him wholly innocent.
Well, of course, one has to be very careful of suspicious projections towards all sorts of disliked public figures, disliked by some at least and not by others. And we had a lot of that material in those days. There was also a rumor around, a suspicion, and I suppose a few people even tried to write articles to this effect. I know one young woman did a parody of Macbeth based on this theme, and the theme was simply that the real source of the assassination was the successor to John F. Kennedy, namely Lyndon Baines Johnson.
No evidence at all to suggest anything along those lines.
And that's silly season, and we've had a long silly season about this assassination. It has gone on now for 17 years.
Yes, I think this caller and others, I would encourage them to read my book, if only for the fact that I've tried to lay down the evidence, rather than starting with speculation and then trying to get the evidence to fit the speculation. If you go for the evidence first and then come up with your thesis at the end of that.
On the other hand, though, could you not be faulted on the basis of the same psychodynamic I've just been talking about? It has been in the air for a long time, certainly over the last 5 years, in America, and I'm sure this has reached over to the United Kingdom as well, to be very suspicious of the American CIA and to impute all sorts of dastardly acts to them. May you not, Anthony, unknowing to yourself, have been caught up in that brand of paranoia is far too strong a word, but in that brand of excess suspicion?
Perhaps. On the other hand, I imagine that your own psychodynamic, as you call it, could be faulted in this program, in the sense that it's through your questioning that we've dwelt so long and so heavily on the intelligence area of this story. What I do feel is that Oswald may certainly in his early life have been connected with, used by U.S. intelligence. A very small part of my book, however, deals with the notion that U.S. intelligence in turn may have been involved in the conspiracy to assassinate the president. They're separate things. It seems to me that a branch of U.S. intelligence may well have been wholly innocently involved in a totally patriotic, honorable way in using Oswald in the years before the assassination. That, of course, however, may have seemed extremely damaging and compromising after the assassination, and may have been part of the sort of area that we could call a benign cover-up. One thing that we haven't talked about is military intelligence, and very briefly on that, something that shocked the Assassination Committee in Congress was the discovery that the following had happened. The Warren Commission had asked the Defense Department for any documents or files it might have on Lee Harvey Oswald. And they said specifically, we mean naval intelligence or army intelligence. Well, naval intelligence did come up with a file, whether or not it was the complete file on Oswald. And the Warren Commission noticed that there'd been no reply, no mention in the letter from the Defense Department about any army intelligence file. So they went back, asked again, and nothing came back from Army intelligence. They were specifically asked, they did not provide a file. We now know from the research of the Congressional Committee in the last couple of years that there was a file, that it existed on Oswald before the assassination, and that it was not given to the Warren Commission, and that since the work of the Warren Commission, that file has been destroyed. It was for that reason that the committee declared itself extremely troubled, and said that it could not exclude the possibility that Oswald had been some sort of tool of military intelligence.
When you raise the question about my psychodynamic processes, you do indeed hoist me on or by my own petard. I think you're right. I have some considerable suspicion about, and some considerable unease about the American intelligence community and about the CIA having slipped out of control in more recent years, and perhaps I'm projecting still further back and thus emphasizing that aspect of your analysis.
Not really, because we have also, within our folly of falling into our psychodynamic, here we have, in fact, come up with all sorts of very specific things that at least justify the notion that one should be extremely alert to the idea of conspiratorial involvement by renegade elements, and I stress renegade elements of U.S. intelligence. We're not sort of yodeling up the canyon.
I've got to tell you about something that happened on this program Friday night when Howard Hunt was here. We talked mostly about Watergate, of course, but I did press him on his earlier career in CIA, and I knew from reading in preparation for the program last Friday, though I only learned it last week when I did some of that preparation, that he had had a major hand in the Bay of Pigs operation and had been the case officer for contact with the Cuban refugee community and their leadership. And I then just began to say a word about mafia interconnections when he flared a bit and said, in possibly a rather intimidating way, I don't know whether he intended it to be intimidating or not, but he said, "Are you accusing me of having been involved with the mafia?" And he had me there to be a polite and decent host. I backed off and said, no, I'm not accusing you of that at all. And he said, "Good, then let us proceed." It was an area of some sensitivity, which does not necessarily mean it was an area in which, in fact, he has any guilt, but it may well be something that he's had to face often in other radio programs, for all I know.
Well, he's also extremely sensitive about suggestions that have been made about him concerning the Kennedy assassination. He's one of the few people who can't remember where he was on the day of the assassination or at the moment that it happened, or at least has produced confusing answers to questions about that. And that little nugget of information aside, more seriously, it's been alleged by the respected reporter Tad Zorc, who repeated to me recently that he was more than ever convinced of his sources on this, that Howard Hunt was, at the time of Oswald's visit to Mexico City before the assassination, and remember that it was Mexico City from which all this information about Oswald links with the Cuban communists came, that one of the officers in the embassy at that time, according to Zorc's sources, was Howard Hunt. Another was a man called David Phillips. David Phillips is a senior CIA officer who ended up a few years ago as chief of Western Hemisphere Division, and at that time he was running anti-Castro operations, and specifically anti-Castro propaganda operations out of the embassy in Mexico City. He's come up with various rather unsatisfactory stories about the nature of U.S. intelligence surveillance of the two embassies in Mexico City, which left the Assassinations Committee staff unsatisfied.
Well, I don't for the moment entertain any thought that Hunt had any connection with the assassination. To the contrary, I was quite impressed by the man in many ways and found him, in his own terms, a man of honor, and though I may make some of our listeners who remember Watergate...
So did I, and I interviewed him myself during my work.
Yeah, I may make some of our listeners angry. I did find him a man of honor, and I think a man of kind of winning decency, though his values may not be my values.
What I would wish to stress is that the U.S. intelligence people, the CIA, have come up with unsatisfactory accounts of their surveillance systems and the visits to the embassies in Mexico City by Lee Oswald. They have not accounted for the fact that although they claimed an extremely thorough photographic surveillance system, they came up with no photographs of the real Oswald visiting the embassies, nor have they accounted for the fact that the tapes, the surveillance tapes of Oswald visiting the embassies were destroyed supposedly routinely before the assassination. And it is interesting that a respected reporter alleges that one of the officers involved in Mexico City at the time was Howard Hunt. That's all.
Well, but his career in CIA had essentially been as a case officer in Latin America, and he had an earlier assignment in Mexico as well, as I remember.
He was the political planner for the Bay of Pigs invasion,
yeah. You know, it's interesting also, as I recall now, somebody anticipated you or preceded you in the theory that the Oswald who visited the embassy in Mexico City was a false or second Oswald. That's, I think, Henry Popkin, of all things, a professor of philosophy out on the West Coast.
Yes, there's long been concern about this. It was never resolved by the Assassinations Committee and remains a key area of investigation. If we could clear up Mexico City and the CIA obfuscation over Mexico City, we might be a lot further forward towards solving the mystery. You know, the man David Phillips I mentioned, I should briefly point out here, was the only person considered publicly by Congress's Assassinations Committee in its report and volumes for possible identification with the cover name Morris Bishop, which was the name supposedly used by the U.S. intelligence case officer involved in those allegations about meetings with Oswald and painting false trails after the assassination. Phillips has denied that he was Bishop. The witness from Alpha 66, the former leader of Alpha 66, has denied that his case officer was David Phillips. However, the committee declared itself unsatisfied with both these responses. It said that it suspected that the leader of Alpha 66 was lying when he said his case officer was not David Phillips, and he said that they said that for his part, David Phillips aroused the committee's suspicion when he said that he didn't recognize Veciana because in his position as a senior officer involved in anti-Castro operations, he would surely have been bound to know a top anti-Castro guerrilla frontman.